What happens with democracy when it is threatened by unrest and violence? Hanne Fjelde is dedicated to answering this question.
Around 1 out of 5 elections see significant levels of violence or intimidation where actors seek to influence the outcome of the elections. And political violence runs counter to maybe the most fundamental principle of democracy, that we want to resolve conflict by non-violent means.
As of 2024, about 40% of the world's population lived in authoritarian states, 16% in what are called hybrid regimes, and 38% in flawed democracies. Of the entire world's population, barely 7% lived in countries that were considered full democracies. And in recent years, this number has been declining.
If citizens associate democracy with chaos and disorder, then citizens are also more likely to turn away from democracy and support authoritarian governments or authoritarian leaders instead.
In a small rural village in a country considered to be one of the strongest democracies, Hanne grew up far away from the unrest she researches today.
I grew up in Rognan, which is a tiny village at the end of a fjord in northern Norway. But I think that my interest in the surrounding world and the curiosity about politics was visible already then. I used to be the guide at the War Memorial Museum. I also worked as a teacher at the refugee reception facility. My parents also took me traveling, and I think jointly these things also sparked maybe the curiosity and the interest in politics and in the surrounding society that led me to pursue a research career.
After her doctoral dissertation at Uppsala University, Hanne traveled around the world, especially through younger democracies in Africa and Asia, to investigate the effects of political violence. But in a world that is changing, she now wants to turn her attention homeward, to the democracies in the West.
During previous periods, 3 out of 4 democracies died at the hands of military coups, with tanks in the street and leaders declaring themselves to be rulers. What is special about democratic decline in the contemporary era is that it happens at the hands of popularly elected leaders who gradually weaken democratic principles from within, restricting civil liberties and political freedoms, silencing opposition, civil society, and the free media.
As part of their study, Hanne and her research group have conducted extensive interviews and surveys among local populations, all to find out how political violence affects people's attitudes and behaviors. Political violence doesn't have to be physical. It can be in the form of hatred and threats directed at voters, political candidates, or independent observers, with the aim of influencing the electoral process and the outcome of the election. But these threats don't always have the effect that their perpetrators hope for. In Nigeria, Hanne and her team investigated how fear of violence affected people's views on democracy. A leading politician had threatened his opponent's voters to discourage them from voting. The results of the study, however, showed that those people who were subject to the threats actually became even more committed to defending their democracy and refused to be silenced.
In my research from Nigeria and India, one thing that we do find is that it's actually those that have the most to lose when democracy is dismantled, that they are also the ones that are most likely to stand up and defend democracy in the wake of threat. So minority groups, opposition supporters, for example, they stand particularly firm and restate their support for democracy in the wake of violence.
But the future of the world's democracies is still uncertain.
When there are tanks in the street and leaders declare themselves as autocrats, it's easy to get alarmed. But now, when democracy dies at the hands of popularly elected leaders and in these small incremental steps, it's much harder to detect what's going on. And I think here, research has a particularly important role to play in identifying these patterns, revealing the associations and the typical trajectories through which this occurs, and in that sense also allow us a better fundament for also doing something about it.